So we've come nearly to the end, and we are going to have comments from our discussants, and we will have a discussion amongst the panel and questions from you remaining stalwarts. And we'll begin the discussants in the reverse order of the first time. So if, Helen, you were waiting for your turn, it is now.
Okay, so we had another amazing panel of speakers. I am probably confabulating as we speak because my mind is so stuffed with information. I heard themes of talk to the people you want to learn about and get their subjective experience, and I'm so excited our field is moving in that direction. We can use power of many tools, neuroscience, personal experiences, biomarkers, everything in between, and that'll just create really interesting, hopefully fully embodied pictures of people within cultural contexts. I think we still really need to add that and continue to grow. Serving on the Mind and Life Fellows Board, I review some Varela grants, and there are people who want to do cross-cultural work, and I think we still have to learn as a field what are the really high-quality methods for that kind of work, and to educate those people about what we want in terms of maybe qualitative and quantitative work, and continue with expanding the methods we use. I guess, so as a clinician, we mostly have to deal with people's confabulations. Like, all we have is self-report, and we have our own self-report and our own experience of what the person is saying and what they really mean. And so one part is paying attention to the verbal content and following, what they're describing, how they're understanding their situation, and very exciting to have all these qualitative reports of all of the words people are using. Another huge part, which I know we're all aware of, is the affective, unconscious information people are presenting to us that's going along with the verbal report. And one thing I really had to develop as a clinician, and it's kind of an intuition, but how much is their verbal report matching what all their other affect is telling me? And one thing I learned to track is how much is the coherence going on, or when do I feel a mismatch? Something that's kind of common. People will laugh when they are actually describing something very painful as a way to avoid or lessen the pain of that. And so I encourage people to also learn how to code in these interviews, some of the nonverbal things going on. But something that happens, which is cool as people progress through psychotherapy, you can sometimes, tracking the coherence, you can feel it increase in the room. They're describing their experiences. Maybe they've learned some more language about emotion, about understanding their own context and identity, and you can feel it. There's a presence, and there's a voice that really feels like I'm really talking to this person. It's less confabulated. We're all kind of confabulating, but it's less so, and that's a very exciting thing to experience in a room with someone, and I'm excited to try to measure that as we keep going. Another thing from clinical experiences, I don't know how much is going on with the teachers for these practices, but sometimes we have to point out what's going on. If someone's affect is not matching their self-report, or if something they just said contradicted something else they said, or they say they want to be really kind to their partner, yet they're screaming at them, things like that, and pointing things out, mismatches in behavior or with values, with what they consider ethical, or you're helping them develop, a code of conduct for themselves. And a really tough part of being a therapist is really calling people out sometimes in a kind and gentle way that they can hear. Sometimes I just, I want to be like, what, use stronger language than I actually do. And I just wonder, isn't sometimes people really need this feedback, because if they're only in their internal space, how do people get feedback in other ways as a form of growth and self-understanding? Okay, I think that's enough for now.
Thank you. Indeed, a very rich day and afternoon. Very hard to even consider what more one could contribute. I think I'm just going to return to the theme that I brought up this morning that I find have even more resonance now. In considering at a deeper level with the people that were presenting this afternoon, really outcomes and evaluation. So I feel in the morning we had a kind of a rhetoric, a conceptual development, and we moved more towards this idea of what are the outcomes we're looking for, what are our methods for evaluation. And on both those points, I'm again drawn to this idea of can we measure or are we even looking for internalizing the values of this practice? This term of spiritual materialism that I'm sure many of you are familiar with just comes to mind when we are looking at not just how many hours of practice or how well someone is sitting or the appropriate teacher that they have in the room, but is someone really internalizing a value of either being of service, if that happens to be their life goal value, being a better husband, being a better wife. Again, my interest in outcomes, maybe just because of my own background and now being in integrative medicine, is what are people doing in the world? What are the observable behaviors we can also tie and tack to these ideas we've been bringing up? So when I'm thinking about this integrated worldview of practice, someone brought up including the marital responses. So if you go home, are you indeed easier to get along with? Maybe do you even clean the dishes before being asked? Whatever it might look like, and how important it is to include those specific kinds of measurements. For myself in my own research, that was very inspiring. To hear that highlighted. And this idea of subjective experience, its relevance, its stickiness, its confabulation. And that's where the outcomes, I think, can bleed into the evaluation. I think there's a huge importance and value to a lot of these practices in forming our identity, who we are, and how we narratively express that identity can be part of our evaluation as well as part of our outcome. So we think of things like EMA or daily tracking, giving people an opportunity to consider what am I doing, why am I doing it, and what is the purpose? And is there an opportunity for us to consider an evaluation, an outcome, and whether or not we can be training people with the same ways that we're measuring them? The other piece that really stood out for me, because I heard His Holiness speak about it at the Mind and Life conference in October, which is why aren't we studying suffering or people who suffer more and more in depth? It's certainly not because we can't find them. And it is a matter of how do we extend our research goals and our interests to include the underserved with an aspect of social justice in mind, but also an aspect of, indeed, the slides presented of people who've gone through great adversity, having some incredible capacities towards practice. So trying to bring those many ideas together, I would just say, again, with great gratitude to be here. A lot of inspiring talk, and I'm very eager to hear how we can learn more from all the folks in the room in terms of measuring and looking deeper into how we integrate these values and then how we deliver them into the world around us. So thank you.
Thank you. That was beautiful. So it's now 10 minutes before my bedtime because I'm on East Coast time and I usually go to bed by around 9 p.m. or a little bit afterwards. So this is going to be even more incoherent than whatever got said by me this morning. I've been thinking a little bit about to what extent this conference has actually achieved the goals that Cliff indicated to me he hoped to achieve in running the conference in the first place. This is a screenshot off of the message that Cliff sent me about all of this. And what he said was, in very broad strokes, he's talking about his goals. I want people to see mindfulness means a spectrum of things, and the scientific data is being used. By the way, data is plural, not singular, so use R in the future. The scientific data are being used way beyond a sober sense of provisional inquiry, and I think both of those goals pretty much have been achieved by the conference, so we can give you 2 thumbs up on that immediately. Mindfulness means lots of things to lots of people, and the data are going far beyond whatever they should. Let's give him a round of applause for having achieved. He ends this part of the message by saying, so the overall paragraph on the program schedule online summarizes the goals, and it's in your brochure. To articulate methodological complexity, to explore unexamined new territories, to highlight the importance of context in interpreting the findings, and examine which research findings and their communication may contribute to unrealistic expectations. So, in my opinion, we have achieved all that as well. Furthermore, in that vein, we've made Ken Wilber even more happy he was after the first session, because if you consider the talks that were given during the afternoon, not only have we now covered all 4 of Ken's quadrants, but we have begun to integrate them. And in particular, Jen, Alex, Kathy, and Willoughby did a great job of integrating quadrants 1 and 2, which are about the internal and the external of the individual experience dimension. Great job. And even beyond that, it turns out we've had at least 2 speakers who integrated all 4 of these quadrants in magnificent style. Melissa, you did that. You spanned his whole 4 quadrants. And the final talk achieved the same goal as well, Judd. So let's give those speakers an especially big round of applause for. Now, there was one topic which I realized, and I've been asking about this repeatedly during the conference, that was not one of Cliff's goals. I thought it had been, but when I look through the material, it's not there, which is, how is this going to help motivate the direction for research in the future? And it seems to me, even though that question was not raised, we started to get a really good answer to that in at least one respect. And for me, the hardest problem that has arisen and become even more apparent as what we ought to try to solve. And I'm not saying this is the only obvious huge problem to try to solve, but it's among the many that's going to need to get solved to take us further, which has to do with the relationship between conscious subjective awareness and different sorts of techniques whereby human beings may report what their subjective experience is. This is actually the problem on which Francisca Varela really got caught up more than 2 decades ago, which led him into a neurophenomenology, about which we've heard considerably as well. But I'm going to suggest, and this is just my one thought in response to, given that research challenge where we ought to go, that we need to be developing further methods of subjective report that transcend whatever's available through the verbal mode. And in particular, I think where we got to go and whom we've got to get involved with doing both the research and the appropriate instruction of our informants is that Barbara Bogan's got to come into the picture, because it seems to me that the use of music, and in particular the cello and whatever, would be a marvelous kind of subjective report to have our participants giving us, to let us know what it is they are experiencing subjectively before, during, and after they have participated in a variety of different kinds of mindfulness practices. So I'm hoping Cliff will get you involved, not just as a performer for the beginning and the end of his conferences, but we'll get you a research line here at the Mind and Brain Center, whereby you can help us out even more than you have already today, which has been a considerable amount.
All right, we will take 5 more minutes.
Okay, how could I not respond to that, Dave? Actually, something that Eve said really resonated with me, which is seeing the manifestation of your mindfulness training as reflected back in the world. And I think that, we can do research on what parts of the brain are being used. We can do research on self-report. But I know in our own lives, when our children were young, I used to go to Spirit Rock for a retreat every now and then. And it was so difficult to try to get away when you have like a 3 and a 6-year-old. And Cliff always did everything he could to make it possible. He'd pick them up from school, he'd take them to their activities, he'd stay home, because he said he benefited more than anyone else when I did a retreat. Because the person that I was when I came back was a much better person in so many different domains. And I'm just curious about, it seems to me that the best way to measure the efficacy of retreats or mindfulness practice is how the person then acts in the world as reflected by people around them. So is that an area of research that sounds promising?
Yeah, we are starting to do that in our research. In the current study where we're collecting data, and in at least 1, if not 2 previous studies, we have specifically contacted the significant other of the participant to ask them those questions. So how has this training affected the person? How has that changed the way they are in relationship to you, in relationship to other people? And I do think that that is one way that we're getting closer at understanding how these practices are integrated into people's lives.
Yeah, I was going to respond to one of Helen's comments, actually, and but go down a road that Barbara's mentioned. And it was about incorporating the nonverbal. And I think one of the things that we probably have a tendency to do is focus somewhat myopically on the transcript when it comes to qualitative data. It's very easy to think that that's a repeatable, somewhat objective way of conducting qualitative analysis, and really all it gives you is a bunch of words on a page. I think good qualitative analysis should include transcription, of course, of interviews, but wherever possible it should include video of the participants so that later on you can go and look at affect. But also, on the part of the researcher, one should be keeping notes either during or immediately after interviews, where you can reflect on what the participant did and told you, even just your sense of whether they were being genuine or not. That's a point of data for us to kind of think about. And that leads me to something that I've had a bit of a chat with some other people here today about, is that I come from a non-scientific background. I have no training in science whatsoever. I'm a sociologist, and a qualitative sociologist who came from a religious studies background, and I guess I feel I have a tendency perhaps to feel somewhat out of place in the Center for Mind and Brain in Cliff's lab, which essentially is a neuroscience lab. One of the things that has come out of this for me today especially is that there's a powerful call here for ethnography. That is the account of a people that we're trying to understand. And one of the things, if we want to understand change that occurs like after a retreat within a community, we need to get pictures of those communities going that can work with the other data that we can gather. That's what context is the context of the community. And so certainly for me as a sociologist, anthropologist, whatever it is that I am, I feel very reassured by today that we have here the breathing space to kind of use Judd's term. And I think it probably, all of the stuff that's come before has been necessary for us to get to the point that we have this breathing space where we can begin to incorporate ethnography and a whole host of other qualitative and quantitative ways of doing the work that is before us.
One comment about something you said to make this conversation between the two of us. But so you had mentioned developing measures that are not provided by the participant of how our participants are behaving while we are assessing them. And interestingly, in the last longitudinal study that we did, we were noticing in our long-term meditator group that there was a subset of them that were very difficult people. They had a very big sense of entitlement. It was really all about them, and they felt very self-important about participating in this study. They really wanted people to bend over backwards to accommodate a wide variety of difficult needs to accommodate. And we found this very interesting given who they were. And we actually, as a result of this, developed a scale in our lab that the experimenters filled out about how easy or difficult or accommodating or not these participants were. And we filled it out for everybody, not just for the long-term meditators, but for the non-meditators and people who were randomized to the MBSR group and the HEP group as well. So we have started to develop those measures, and we'll see what they lead to, but I think it's a really good suggestion and observation that may help us to understand why some people are moving in one direction as a result of these practices, while other people are moving in very different directions as a result of these practices, and why.
What is that the maintenance scale? What do you call it?
It's called the P scale, and it came from the princess and the P.
The divas compared to the devas. So in this, I guess, last set of reflections, and I think coming primarily from some of the respondents, I've been hearing this gesturing towards issues of values. Perhaps as a way of getting at some of the behavioral changes that we're interested in studying, taking up the cue from the very first talk to look at this in a more embodied way, and not just as about minds and brains, but about people and bodies and being in embedded social situations. And I very much, I think, applaud that and think that there's something to that. And I guess what I'm struggling to reconcile is how observing behavior, such as I think the example that was given of spontaneous proclivity to do the dishes without being asked, which great thing to perhaps being measured. I'm wondering how that relates to the cube that John and Cliff and Amishi and Antoine are creating, where the three metrics of that are meta-awareness and object orientation and a de-reification. It doesn't sound, I don't really quite understand, I guess, how those three components of mindfulness in that sense would be related to some of these measurable behavioral outcomes. And what I think we're measuring or looking to measure when we're talking about these sort of behavioral outcomes is not mindfulness in that very kind of technical sense, but more mindfulness in the sense that Bob Scharf was talking about as basically a culture and a whole set of worldviews and values that are embedded within that. And so as we kind of negotiate this space from investigating mindfulness in a sort of maybe hyper-technical sense that might be more easily accomplished by brain imaging and so forth, to wanting to also accommodate some of these behavioral things, it seems like we're necessarily slipping more into mindfulness as culture and less mindfulness as technique. And would be curious to hear various thoughts and reflections on that challenge, that difficulty in doing this research.
So I want to just respond to that, because the model was explicitly developed in a sort of formal practice setting, right. But there is just a slight rotation, an orthogonal rotation, as John would say, to consider applying the model to not formal practice. And one of the things that we talk about in tasks is task set retention as part of meta-awareness. Mm-hmm. And one of the great phrases that I can recall hearing in the last decade has been David Meyer's "the task of life," which includes the dishes. And so I think that a very dynamic and intimate relationship to competing agendas and having a certain kind of attentive sensitivity to moments of salience on multiple dimensions actually constitutes, a beautiful life well lived. And I think one can conceptualize those dimensions in terms of what might even be called skillful means in a domestic situation.
But I think one thing I would also say here about that model in particular and its relationship. So if we think of it in terms of it's about formal practice, and then there's the time after practice or between sessions, that the axiological frameworks, which include not just ethics, but other kinds of values, aesthetics, and so on, are going to be most active in the in-between session times, even if you are rehearsing them during your session. Because during your formal session, you're maybe walking on a chankrama, but a lot of the time you're probably sitting on a cushion. So you're not really engaging in the world in the same way. So when you're actually out in the world doing things, that's when those axiological frameworks are going to be most active. And it seems, and the model is not actually deliberately doesn't try to promote any particular axiological framework, because although we may think that there is a single axiology for mindfulness, and in our culture in the West, there is actually there tends to be a vaguely defined set of values and ethics and virtues that's typical of the mindfulness that even appears on the cover of Time magazine. But actually, there's a very clear diversity of axiologies in the Buddhist traditions where mindfulness is deriving from. And just to give you one very brief example, so you can have the sense that the upright practitioner is someone who maintains their vows and would never, for example, touch a woman. That would be the proper form of ethics for a strict Theravadan monk to maintain. Or you could be in the Kagyu tradition, and you could think that you are to behave like Drupa Kunlek, whose famous life story begins with him seducing his mother. He didn't actually, she agreed, but he said, no, never mind. But yes, so the sort of contrast about how are we configuring, and there's a whole backstory to that, but that's a sort of, yes, it's a deliberate shocker, just in case you were wondering. So those are very different ethical frameworks that are deploying, in many cases, similar styles of practice. And they are encompassed by, so the idea that there's just going to be a single kind of framework of virtues and values and so on that's going to be the one true axiology for mindfulness, I think, is really problematic. Mindfulness, to my mind, is a way of inculcating, of living, of embodying those virtues and values and so on, but it itself doesn't have any particular one. That would be my opinion on the matter.
So I was just reading this chapter on the airplane, and got up to about page 35. And on the basis of doing this, it seems to me that there's actually content in the model, which really isn't a model, it's a taxonomic framework, as opposed to what at least people like me, physicists and so forth, would call a model. In any case, though, that's the first time you've ever nodded yes in my presence to something I uttered. There is this concept of meta-awareness. And meta-awareness is a really deep, subtle concept which includes multiple components. There's what's called background awareness. And there is a mechanism that, as a result of you noticing what's going on in the background, may cause you to turn inward and become introspective, after which, based upon whatever your axiological values may be, could lead you to proceed in some other direction. And if you then take into account that your task set when you're off the cushion is going about the so-called task of life, and you have the right values, and you're in the kitchen, and you're paying attention to one thing, but you have really good background awareness, which is part of meta-awareness, and you're noticing somebody's needing help with the dishes, this will lead you to become introspective, and as a result, you'll actually take up the subtask of doing the dishes. So while I am sympathetic to your wondering about how this might apply in the real world, it seems to me, at least based on doing a little bit of thinking in terms of the computations that are taking place. And I think you can attach computational analysis to this framework as well. It would extend into real world situations, not just the meditation temple.
I think so too, although I would be hesitant. I don't want to make the claim. He wants to make the claim.
Well, I would be happy to make the claim. Then you don't have to bear the guilt if it turns out to have been too excessive.
So the grains of sand are dwindling down. Do we have some pressing points? So yes, then let's.
It's just a question about the adverse reaction study, and I in one sense, it's just asking for some clarification, because during the PowerPoints, you were saying that you can't find any sense of a way of practicing too much or too little, and also no sense of there being a good or bad way to practice or something like that. But then in the question and answer, it seemed like there was like at least sort of a type A thing going on with that. So I wanted a little clarification about that. Then I was just wondering if there's something about the democratic nature in which it seems as though your study is surveying in a very democratic nature a whole range of teachers about their interpretations of what might be, the problem here with the meditation, and if that method is sort of scientific as it seems, like to sample widely, but that might just create such a mix that you'll never get a coherent answer. But when you talk, it sounds like you're noticing patterns, or you have some insight into this.
Yeah. So those are very astute observations, and actually, the answer is actually somewhat they're related, in that what I found when I interviewed so many teachers across different traditions and within traditions, I found a lot of teachers hearing, because we would talk about different kinds of difficulties that would come up, and one of the very common reactions was, well, those Theravadins, they do this, or like, oh, if you just practice more concentration, then, so there was a lot of shit talking. And I was like, and so this was very much against my dream of that it was like, okay, there is not going to be a consensus here. So in some ways, part of my kind of listing the mythologies is to start to undermine that there's going to be somebody's got it right, and if we just do it that way, this can be avoidable. So in some ways, that was strategic, and I do think that there are certain kinds of practice orientations, and there's definitely certain teachers that have a much higher casualty list than others. So there's, it's not completely benign, but I guess what I'm trying to do is be diplomatic and to have a representation of different viewpoints, and there doesn't seem to be any school or practice that's immune, and so to try to keep it sort of the infighting amongst the different factions, which I totally didn't expect. I'm not a scholar, so I was caught off guard by that, but I'm sure you're not surprised. I thought all Buddhists got along and it was all peaceful and stuff. So I guess so that's part of why I'm saying that, is that nobody's immune. This happens with the best teachers. I'm trying to counteract a lot of the sort of blaming that's going on. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah. So, but there's lots. Yeah.
But would you name names so that we won't go there? Yes, now.
That's the problem of the mean. There are individual differences.
But you are perceiving some patterns because it sounds when people are asking you, it seems like you do have a little bit of.
Well, and the other problem is that.
No, take that one.
Oh. The other problem is that I'm also noticing a number of types of interpretive frameworks that I actually find very harmful. And so we're not actually done analyzing the data, but to some extent I want to put those out there when I have an opportunity with an audience, especially one that's like, there are people who have a lot of influence and are going to be teaching and that kind of thing, that some of them, those sort of mythologies, and you use the term like lazy assumptions, are actually can be very harmful. Like, if you've had problems, then obviously you must have a psychiatric vulnerability. And even though you don't think you have one, because you had problems, you actually do. And things like that. So so to some extent, this is preliminary. It's not done. So I'm doing the best I can to kind of like do damage control early on. So yeah.
So we're going to have time to continue this conversation in a reception after the closing.